Welcome back. So in this part of our lecture on Heidegger, we're going to focus on authenticity and also different modes of being. So at this point, we're looking at the passage in your reader that talks about care as the being of Dasein, and particularly section 40, the basic state of mind of anxiety as a distinctive way in which Dasein is disclosed. So we're going to unpack further themes from Division 1 of Being and Time, reference and signification, everything to do with signs, serviceability, tools and equipment, and different moods of Dasein. The concept of authenticity and inauthenticity and some of the problems with that, the idea of facticity and the they, or das Man, and temporality, the experience of time. So let's look at assignment and reference. Heidegger says Dasein lives spatially in an environment or Umwelt surrounded by the ready-to-hand or equipment, a world of tools. So we've been looking at the meaning of tools. Tools have meaning within a context, and we assign meanings to tools. So tools basically refer us to their meanings. We've assigned meanings to tools in the shared world, and then when we encounter those tools, we're referred to their meanings. So essentially our experience of tools is our experience of the interrelation between tools, because they're all being referring to some kind of broader surrounding world. So Heidegger has things to say about how the meaning of these signs and tools get set up. You might remember we mentioned the towards which, the network of references and assignments which tools belong to. And we could understand this as that towards which the tools point us. What do they point us to? The network of references and assignments. Heidegger says signs, in the first instance, are themselves items of equipment whose specific character as equipment consists in showing or indicating. So we don't normally think about signs as tools, but Heidegger points to the ways in which they are. They have a little job to do. They're useful to us. So for instance, this arrow serves to show or indicate where we should go. Signs indicate something to us. For instance, the car indicator arrow or light, tells us which way it's going to turn. So they've got an indicative structure. There's a dual structure to signs, Heidegger thinks. On the one hand, you've got a ready-to-hand thing, for example, a lever for us to push, which might be connected to a light that then flashes on to tell the other drivers which way we're turning, but also a thing indicating something else. It tells other drivers the direction I will turn, refers to concepts of left and right in relation to space more generally. So there's this series of references to a broader and broader world that little sign, that little indicate light is connected to. So on the one hand, a ready-to-hand thing, a lever. On the other hand, referencing this broader world of spatiality and driving and roads and road systems and so on. Heidegger relates signs to circumspection. Signs of the kind we have described, he said, let what is ready to hand be encountered. He talks about an item of equipment which explicitly raises a totality of equipment into our circumspection so that together with it, the worldly character of the ready to hand announces itself. So circumspection literally means looking around. Circa is around. And it's Umsicht in German. So we've got seeing things around us as equipment, basically, and it's a kind of practical seeing. So Heidegger's talking about the practical way we look around us, see the things that we need to use to get jobs done, right? And so signs of the kind we have described, he says, let what is ready to hand be encountered. So signs will tell us, okay, here is the thing you need to do. This is the way you need to go. We can encounter what is ready to hand, what is ready to be used for our practical projects. So how do signs arise in the first place? How do we establish signs? Well, one example Heidegger considers is, say, a farmer. A farmer knows the environment well enough. So, for instance, the farmer experiences a south wind and understands from the past that south wind means it's going to rain. Maybe for people in an urban area, it doesn't mean anything, but for a farmer, it means, all right, this usually comes along with rain. Heidegger gives a classic example of a knot in a handkerchief. Maybe today we'd just put a little notification on our phone to remind us to do something. But in the days when people walked around with handkerchiefs in their pockets, putting a knot in your handkerchief, you'd put your hand in to get the handkerchief, you'd feel the knot and go, oh, right, I had to do something, right? So basically you set up a sign by connecting some kind of practical thing in the world with a kind of meaning. So the wind gets set up with a meaning, or the knot in the handkerchief gets set up with a meaning. And essentially, Heidegger explains signs as being conspicuousness against a background of inconspicuousness. The sign jumps out at us, right? Or a good sign will jump out at us. When we're driving, we need signs to be really clear, really bright, so we can see them at night or in a cloudy day. They need to really jump out at us so that we can see very clearly, where we need to go, what we need to do, right? So signs have to have this quality of conspicuousness. Signs indicate something we must do as part of our concernful dealings with the world. There's that phrase, concernful dealings, again. So something we must do, signs command us to do things. They're imperatives. You must do this. You must get the sheep in. You must remember to buy a present for your friend's birthday. Whatever it is you need to do, you must do it, right? Signs tell you need to turn left, you need to turn right. You must do these things. So this all points us back to a world of projects. All signs, tools, and equipment point back to Dasein, to our human being. Who assigns meaning? We assign meaning. We assign meaning, and we determine the references of signs and equipment. Ultimately, they all refer to our projects, because these projects are the way Dasein interprets its existence, right? What am I in the world? How do I understand my being in the world? Well, through projecting myself in the world, through setting up all these kinds of projects I do. It might be having a family. It might be studying at uni. It might be moving to a new place. It might be reading this particular book or cooking this particular meal, but they're all projects in Heidegger's sense of project. I always interpret the world, he thinks, against the background of whatever projects I'm concerned with at the time. So this is important, the connection between projects and interpretation. Interpretation doesn't happen in a vacuum. It happens in the context of a particular human project. So for instance, I see rain as bad weather if I want to dry my clothes outside. I'm like, oh damn, I was going to put the clothes out to dry today and it's raining. Or I see it as good weather if I want to grow my plants. I'm like, yes, more rain. That's what's happening in Armidale at the moment. The rain is helping our summer crops. So the summer crops in Armidale are really extending this year because of lots of rain and sun. So Heidegger also uses this term average everydayness, we've come across already, to talk about Dasein. So he uses this phrase, it's a very evocative phrase, to talk about our usual state. Now, he thinks our average everydayness, our usual state, is usually inauthentic. And what this means is it's not really mine. Okay, well, that's a bit weird. You might think, well, if it's not mine, then whose is it? If not really me, then who am I? This experience is not mine. Well, whose does it belong to? Well, Heidegger's answer is it's part of what he calls the they. So what happens in our average everydayness is we don't really own our own existence as Dasein, as being there. Let's talk more about this they. It sounds very ominous. So essentially the they, or das Man, is the anonymous effect of others upon us. Okay. Sometimes it's translated as the anyone in English. It's the way in which others dominate my possibilities, but in an anonymous way. Okay, it's not any one particular person. Of course, particular people may influence us, but it's more generally other people in a general sense. Okay, it's the sense in which I do what other people do, but I'm not even aware of it that much. I do not question the dominance of this. Heidegger calls this living as a they self. Okay, and so he's saying that this is pretty naturally what everybody does most of the time. You know, we live in a social world. We sort of, even without thinking about it, we just kind of follow what other people do. However, he thinks certain moods can jolt us out of this. There can be ways of tuning into the world, just as there are ways of tuning out of it. We can reveal how the world as a whole is for me, we can think about it as something I live. It's not cognitive on this sense, but it's actually existential. So, traditionally, we might understand by philosophy tells us that this is merely subjective. But for Heidegger, it tells us something objective about our being in the world. That is, if we're talking about how we are in the world or how the world is for me, the for me means it's just subjective, right? That's how philosophy might traditionally understand it. But Heidegger thinks it tells us something beyond my particular subject. It actually tells us something about being in the world generally. So what kind of moods, our ways of tuning into the world, what kind of moods can reveal this? Well, the two moods Heidegger focuses on here are anxiety and fear. Heidegger talks about idle talk as being one of the moods of Dasein. In our everyday mode, he says we use idle talk or hearsay. He says, this is a commentator King, it is the kind of talk that hears, that understands what is said, then passes on or says on what has been learned by hearing without getting to the bottom of what the talk is about. So Heidegger thinks this is basically passing on, literally hearsay. You pass on what you hear, you gossip, you just talk in a kind of undirected way without totally understanding, without taking the time to understand or digest what is being said. So on this view, Heidegger considers it to be a fallen form of discourse. He says we don't reflect on what we're hearing and what we're saying to others. We are just thrown, which means we're thrown completely into the present and we're not thinking about the meaning of what we're doing. So Heidegger has this category of falling moods, okay, where falling is a term he used to mean being completely absorbed in the present. And it has a threefold structure. Firstly, idle chatter, we've just talked about. Secondly, curiosity. This is an inauthentic mode of understanding. It's a way of understanding, but he says, I don't own my possibilities. I flit from one possibility to another. So for Heidegger, this is a kind of surface level interest in things, but not strong enough to yield deep understandings. And also in curiosity, mere curiosity, I don't connect my interests with myself in a deeper sense. I'm just kind of flitting from one thing to another, one thing to another. So you might either do this yourself, or maybe you know someone who does it, who's sort of, enrolled in something and then changed their mind, enrolled in something and changed their mind, and never ever kind of gets into something particular, or takes something up and then drops it, takes something up and then drops it. Heidegger thinks, that's a mode of being that kind of means you never go sort of deeply into understanding anything. You're just sort of flitting around from one possibility to another, and you never own any particular interest. You never say, oh, that's something I'm really interested in, or that's something that really relates to me. And then there's ambiguity of importance. Heidegger says this is a situation where on the one hand, everything is endlessly interesting, which is sort of good. It's good to be interested in things and find things interesting. But it also can be very distracting, along with idle chatter and curiosity. Why? Because Heidegger says, and this is section 37 of Being and Time, I can't tell what is important or not. It's like if everything's important, nothing is important. Nothing stands out. So it's not clear to me what is or is not important. It has this ambiguous character, right? Okay, another mood of Dasein is anxiety or Angst in the German. Now, it's important to note this is not anxiety about anything in particular. It's a mood whereby all significance of things collapses. So the meanings of things collapse. And essentially this kind of crisis, it forces me out of the they self, and I'm forced to find myself, because I realize that I am responsible for giving meaning and significance to things. So anxiety is sort of bad good. It's sort of scary, but it helps people to understand the meaning-giving role of their own existence. So on page 50 of your reader, Heidegger says, anxiety makes manifest in Dasein its being towards its own most potentiality for being. That is, it's being free, for the freedom of choosing itself and taking hold of itself, end quote. So what he's trying to say is that this mood makes manifest the nature of our own being as potentiality, I'm suddenly aware of my capabilities, the fact that I'm free to choose things, to take hold of myself, to change things. So somebody might be forced in this realization to kind of make a big change in their life because they suddenly realize that they have that capability. So Heidegger uses this term uncanniness to explain the experience of anxiety. He says, in anxiety, one feels uncanny. But here, uncanniness also means not being at home. Uncanniness can mean sort of like eerie or spooky, feeling lost, uneasy, and unfamiliar, right? Now, importantly for Heidegger, these are not just feelings or emotions. They're actually a structure of our being. That is, our being is structured in such a way that we have these kinds of experiences. It tells us that the everyday, uncritically examined world of the they is not our real world, right? So most of the time we sort of feel at home, and we just kind of accept the world that's been constructed by everyone else as our own world. However, in these kinds of experiences like anxiety, we can suddenly realize that's not really the world that we've chosen ourselves. So when we have fallen, Heidegger thinks we feel at home in the world, but it's kind of fake hominess, right? You feel at home, but you're not really at home. Interestingly, Heidegger says uncanniness is the more primordial state. That's on page 52 of your reader. The more primordial state, which means it's basic in some sense. So the commentator Brentio, and this is on your reading list, from a piece on your reading list, he says, anxiety seems to mean a breakdown of all ordinary understanding and activity in the space of a moment. The alienation that comes from this hiatus shows us that the world in this particular moment has nothing to offer us in terms of which to make sense of our own lives. So usually we can look to the world to kind of give us some sense of what's going on in our own lives. There's some sort of resources out there in the world. But in a moment of anxiety, it becomes clear that it's up to us to decide which of those resources might make sense. In other words, responsibility falls back upon us, not upon the world. There's an interesting distinction to be made here between anxiety and fear. Okay. Importantly, anxiety does not concern itself with a particular object, right? So it's general where fear is specific. Anxiety, Heidegger says, is shrinking back in the face of being in the world itself. Whereas fear is shrinking back in the face of something threatening, for example, a bear, right? It's specific, it's localized, it concerns the ready to hand or present to hand, and being with others is enabled. We're scared, but we're not necessarily alone. We might be, yelling out for someone to help us. And for Heidegger, it's ontic, it's to do with the nature of small b being, not so much to do with being itself in a general sense. Whereas anxiety is general, it comes from nowhere, it's not localized, it's not this particular bear in this particular spot, and it concerns no object in the world. Being with others in this situation is actually disabled. So although normally there's Mitsein, there's no Mitsein, or perhaps there's to put it strictly in Heideggerian terms, there's a deficient mode of Mitsein, but it feels like there's no others out there who can help us in this situation. And it's ontological. This is something experienced by everyone, potentially all the time. It's not to do with particular situations of some particular thing that threatens us. We've already looked at that. So fear is distinct from anxiety in that it's about a particular thing. For instance, another Dasein, another human being, another thing, an event. This is talked about in section 30. So we have fear of what we're fearful of, for example, bears. Then we've got fear itself. This discloses the fearsome, Heidegger thinks. It's latent. For example, the revealing of a bear as a grizzly bear and not a teddy bear, right? So fear itself is the disclosing of the nature of the fearsomeness. What is it exactly that we're fearful here? It's not all the bears, it's particular kinds of bears. And then there's fear for ourselves. What are we worried about? Well, ourselves, our existence, or for what belongs to us. For example, our lives, our limbs, and so on, right? Or maybe the bear's getting your food. You're worried about your food. In some sense, it's threatening you and what belongs to you. So behind all this is a kind of notion of some more or less idealized state, although it's not clear how much Heidegger is trying to sort of endorse it or promote it. And that is the notion of authenticity. To be authentic for Heidegger is a situation where my existence is lived as mine. I truly own my existence. To be inauthentic is a situation where my existence is lived as not mine or part of the they, part of the general social milieu. Heidegger thinks most of the time we live inauthentically, and he seems to be saying, although he uses this somewhat judgmental language, he seems to be saying it's not a moral failing. It's just a fact about Dasein. It's a fact about being in the world that most of the time we're inauthentic. So it's important to note for Heidegger, authentic and inauthentic is not just a synonym for moral and immoral. Okay, there's something more going on here. We can relate this to the notion of homeliness as well. Excuse me. When we are most at home with ourselves is when we are authentic. When I initiate or take up possibilities on my own that truly come from myself, it's authentic. Inauthentic moments are where we do not treat things as affecting us deeply in our own most being. That is, we sort of shut off things from affecting our innermost being. And importantly, it's not immoral. Now, this is against what Sartre will go on to say, because he does judge people for being inauthentic. But Heidegger seems to hold back from doing that, but he is making this distinction. Now, the term facticity is relevant here. Heidegger says uses this term facticity to talk about the unchangeable facts of our life. This is a term that Sartre will take up too. We inherit facticity, he thinks, but we must take it over as our own. So this becomes a big deal in existentialism. What about all the things you can't change or you just didn't get a choice about? So you can think about things you inherit. You know, people can inherit a tendency to be an alcoholic. You can inherit a quick temper or an artistic talent. You're born in a place or you're given a particular situation that you really did not choose. Well, there's a lot we don't choose in our own lives. We don't seem to have any freedom over. However, Heidegger thinks, well, at any one time, whatever this facticity is, we can have authentic or inauthentic modes of dealing with these facts. How do we get out of inauthenticity into a more authentic state of being? Heidegger refers to the call of conscience as having an effect upon us in this way. He calls this the voice beneath the idle chatter of everyday existence. So we were talking about idle chatter before. Idle chatter could also, refer to sort of social media. Like, there's all this there's all these voices telling us things all the time. We're reading other people's opinions all the time, or people shouting at each other, and it can obscure perhaps more important voices or more important things we need to listen to. So Heidegger thinks if we could just get beneath this idle chatter of everyday existence, we'd hear the call of conscience. Now, what does this call tell us? Well, Heidegger says this call of conscience tells us to be, or calls us to be, resolute in the face of death. And essentially, it's a questioning. As William Large puts it, a commentator on Heidegger, he says, the unsettling voice which questions everything I have achieved and accomplished, the silent ontological disquiet disclosed to me in anxiety, end quote. So this might be familiar as the classic, 3 a.m. dilemma, that, you wake up at 3 a.m., there's something about 3 o'clock in the morning where everything can seem worse, or all your problems loom really large, or it's kind of eerie and weird, and so that, you're kind of free to think more freely, because no one's chattering in the background. And so anxiety can come up, but in such a way that it can disclose something very important. So it questions a lot of things, but it might help you to become resolute in facing challenges in the future. So it calls you to think about and reflect upon what it means to be human, because for Heidegger, the meaning of Dasein is part of that meaning is the fact that we are questioning. We're questioning beings. So if you're questioning things, you're becoming more human. So it's what it means to be human, is to question things. So the classic 3 a.m. kind of unsettling feeling. Now, there's issues surrounding authenticity. So Stambau in the Salus collection which I reference at the end, identifies an ambiguity in Heidegger's account. One question we can ask here is, look, what comes first for Dasein, authenticity or inauthenticity? Which one is natural? And what does coming first mean? Is it ontologically coming first or temporally coming first? That is it kind of more basic as a form of being, or is it just that somehow like we're born authentic and then we become inauthentic, or vice versa? And so, as we've seen, Heidegger says that inauthenticity can be kind of quite natural to us. But what does he mean by natural here? Well, Stambauer says inauthenticity is what comes first, in the sense of what we find first of all and most of the time. Nobody is born authentic. Okay, so he's saying, you can interpret Heidegger as saying we're actually, born inauthentic, and authenticity is something you kind of have to work out after the case, after the fact. But we could ask, well, what if coming first means primordial or basic? The inauthentic is simply a flight from authenticity, however prevalent that inauthenticity may be. So it might be that fundamentally we are authentic. It's just that most of the time we just fall into this inauthentic mode. But underneath it somehow there's this authenticity waiting to be, discovered. You could see it as a turning away from the question of being, or being as questioning. That to be inauthentic is to stop the questioning part of yourself, stop questioning things. So it becomes clear, Lage says, that it is ultimately authentic Dasein which can lead us to an insight into the meaning of being. Inauthenticity gets stuck in the things and affairs of the world, in beings. So on this view, authenticity is a kind of moral issue, in that it's going to help us to not get stuck in the world of small b beings and to come more truly into the world of capital B being. And you can see this reading on Reading List by Stroh. Stroh says, if Dasein is essentially being in the world, then it makes little sense that it would no longer be itself when it becomes absorbed in the world. So this is an interesting critique Stroh offers. What's so wrong with being absorbed in the world? Aren't we being in the world? So this is an interesting question surrounding it, surrounding the notion of authenticity, and it's a debate that's still raging to this day. So have a think about, what you think authenticity really is and how basic you think it is. Stroh says, if Dasein is essentially being the world, then it makes little sense that it would no longer be itself. Okay, let's talk about temporality. Heidegger thinks this is the key to Dasein. Temporality makes possible the unity of existence, facticity, and falling prey, and thus constitutes primordially the totality of the structure of care. The factors of care are not pieced together cumulatively any more than temporality has first been put together out of future, past, and present in the course of time. Temporality is not in a being at all. It is not, but rather temporalizes itself. This is classic Heidegger way of writing, rather dense. What he's basically trying to say is temporality structures our existence through its movement itself. It's not a thing in itself, but a kind of movement that we experience. Okay. And he divides the nature of our relationship to the world based on temporality into things like facticity and falling prey, which we'll talk about. So usually I live my past and future through the present. In authentic existence, I live my past and present through the future, and it's a completely different kind of temporality. So as we've seen, Heidegger thinks we are fundamentally futural beings, but we can kind of fall into the present where we sort of forget about structuring ourselves towards the future. Lage says authenticity is not an empty projection into the future, but always determined by our past. In authenticity, we take up what we already were. That is, we own our facticity in history. So Lage is making the point that to be authentic is to have a very particular relationship towards our past, even if Dasein is essentially futural, that is future-directed. So there's a lot of issues around time there, and what happens is Jean Paul Sartre will take up this theme of time in his great work, Being in Time. And so that's what we'll have an introduction to next week, and more generally the topic of existentialism as it becomes known in philosophy.